Germany produces more of them than any other submarine.
The Type 7 U-boat is actually a bit on the small side. They're one of the smaller submarines of the First World War. It did have significant seagoing capacity.
400 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean,
An Italian diver discovers an astonishing U-boat wreck. The submarine is virtually intact, resting nearly 400 feet underwater.
Italian diver Roberto Raldi's flashlight catches something that makes his blood run cold. A massive shadow rising from the mud, its bow pointing upward like a frozen scream. But here's what stops him completely. The entrance hatch is sealed shut, twisted metal, locked from the outside by the ocean itself. 50 men are still inside. For 66 years, the German submarine U-455 had been nothing but a name on a missing list. No wreckage, no survivors, no answers. Families spent decades wondering what happened to their fathers, brothers, and sons who vanished in 1944. The German Navy had no records, no distress signals, no explanation, just silence. But when Raldi discovered that wreck in 2010,
May 2010. An Italian diver discovers an astonishing U-boat wreck.
he found something far more tragic than anyone imagined. Because U-455 didn't just sink, it died in the cruelest way possible. After surviving 9 deadly missions, after threading through what most considered an impossible passage, after escaping British destroyers and American aircraft, this submarine met its end because of one catastrophic mistake. Here's what makes this story even more haunting. 2 men from U-455's crew are still alive today. They served on this submarine, knew every man who died, and escaped death by chance. What they revealed about life aboard that steel coffin makes you understand why this isn't just another World War II story. It's about 50 men trapped in a machine with no way out. During World War II, nothing struck more fear into Allied sailors than the German U-boat. Nazi propaganda called them the Grey Wolves.
These submarines, nicknamed the Grey Wolves, were true predators.
Silent hunters that prowled the Atlantic, stalking convoys with ruthless precision. They were painted as invincible, the pride of Hitler's navy, striking without warning and vanishing before anyone could retaliate. But here's what the propaganda never showed you. Life aboard a Type 7C submarine like U-455 was nothing short of hell. 50 men crammed into a steel tube just over 220 feet long, living for weeks without ever seeing sunlight. The smell alone would make most people vomit. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat, unwashed bodies, and the constant stench of oil that clung to everything. Fresh water was so scarce that crews went unwashed for entire missions, saving every drop for cooking or machinery. Privacy didn't exist. Bunks were shared in shifts, meaning you slept in sheets still warm and damp from whoever used them before you. The submarine carried 44 men, but only had 33 bunks. Men slept next to machinery, in the torpedo room, anywhere they could wedge themselves horizontally. Meals were eaten next to torpedoes that doubled as storage racks, and the galley was so small that only one person could work in it at a time. Food was another nightmare. Fresh provisions lasted maybe a week before everything turned to canned goods and moldy bread. By the 3rd week of a patrol, men were eating the same grey soup, the same rock-hard biscuits. The smell of rotting food, mixed with diesel and human waste, created an atmosphere so thick you could taste it with every breath. And the noise, the constant thrum of engines, never stopped, drilling into your skull until you couldn't remember what silence sounded like. But here's where it gets worse. The real terror wasn't the living conditions, it was the waiting. Hours could pass with nothing but whispered conversations and the hum of equipment. Then suddenly, sonar would pick up the telltale pings of Allied destroyers hunting above. The submarine would dive deeper, the air growing hotter, condensation dripping from steel walls while men held their breath. Each depth charge explosion shook the submarine like a tin can, leaving crews wondering if the next one would crack the hull wide open. The mental strain broke men, yet Nazi propaganda kept telling them they were Germany's finest warriors, predators who walked the deep and struck fear into enemy hearts. And for a while, in those early war years, the reputation seemed earned. U-boats ravaged Atlantic shipping routes, nearly bringing Britain to its knees by cutting off food, fuel, and weapons. Hitler called them his trump card, the weapon that would force the Allies to surrender. U-455 was born into this world in 1941. A Type 6C submarine commanded by Hans-Heinrich Geisler, a career officer described as reserved but steady, the kind of leader who instilled quiet confidence rather than fear. Born in 1911, Geisler had served with the German Navy long before submarines became the terror of the seas. His calm demeanor would become a lifeline for the crew in moments when panic could mean death. The submarine's first missions in Norway brought nothing but frustration. Weeks of claustrophobic endurance with zero results. The crew patrolled cold waters, searching for Allied ships that never materialized. Each fruitless mission chipped away at morale. Men started wondering if they'd ever see action, if all the training and suffering would amount to anything. But when U-455 was redeployed to the Atlantic, everything changed. They scored their first victory, sinking the British Workman, a tanker carrying precious fuel. The crew was given permission to come on deck and watch the ship burn, flames licking the night sky while lifeboats scattered across the water. It was a sight that stayed with them. Then came another cargo vessel. Suddenly, the crew tasted what it felt like to be hunters who'd drawn blood. They celebrated when they returned to port, greeted by music and the head of the flotilla himself. For a brief moment, U-455 and its crew felt invincible. But by 1943, the tide turned. Allied forces developed better radar, more effective sonar, long-range aircraft, and devastating depth charges. The Atlantic became a graveyard for U-boats. The hunters became the hunted. Submarines that left port often never returned, their crews simply disappearing into the ocean's depths. This was the world U-455 operated in, a deadly game where survival was the exception, not the rule. And their next mission would test them like nothing before, because to reach the Mediterranean battlefield, they'd have to attempt something most considered suicide. January 1944. The war's momentum had shifted dramatically. Allied forces were tightening their grip on North Africa and Italy, and every available German submarine was ordered to disrupt their supply lines. Among those chosen was U-455. Their mission seemed straightforward on paper: enter the Mediterranean and hunt Allied convoys along the Italian coast. But to get there, they'd have to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar. Think about threading a needle while blindfolded. Now imagine doing it while being hunted. That was Gibraltar. Barely 9 miles wide at its narrowest point, it was guarded day and night by Allied patrols. Radar stations tracked every movement. Spotlights swept the water. For U-455, this crossing meant everything. Success would open the door to fresh targets. Failure meant death in a steel coffin, crushed by depth charges or snagged in underwater nets designed specifically to trap submarines. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening in January, U-455 sealed its hatches and submerged beneath the waves. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Lights dimmed. Whispers replaced normal conversation. Every man understood what was at stake. The next 40 hours would decide whether they lived or died. Commander Geisler had a plan. Strong Atlantic currents punched through the strait, and he intended to use them to hide the submarine's presence. U-455 would crawl along the ocean floor, moving inch by inch while the crew counted every ping of sonar, every creak of metal. Here's what made it unbearable. The longer a submarine stayed submerged, the worse the air became. Carbon dioxide built up with every breath the crew took. Temperature rose as body heat and machinery combined in the sealed tube. Men sweated in the suffocating heat, their uniforms soaked through. Every breath tasted like diesel fumes mixed with the metallic tang of fear. The crew wore cork-soled shoes to avoid making noise on the metal floors. They couldn't speak above whispers. Even the cook had to stop preparing meals because the clanging of pots could give them away. One dropped tool, one periscope raised at the wrong moment, one cough at the wrong time could lead to discovery. The tension was so thick you could feel it pressing against your chest. Men counted the hours. 40 hours underwater with minimal oxygen. Some crew members started showing signs of carbon dioxide poisoning, headaches, dizziness, confusion. But they couldn't surface. Not yet. Not while Allied destroyers prowled above, like wolves waiting for prey to emerge. Allied destroyers prowled above, their sonar operators listening for any anomaly. They waited for the chance to release depth charges that could shred a submarine's hull in seconds. Aircraft circled overhead, watching for oil trails or telltale wakes. To the men of U-455,
the U-boat skipper watches and confirms the explosion through his periscope, and a loud cheer grows up from his crew.
it felt like swimming beneath a ceiling of knives, each one ready to plunge down and strike. For nearly 2 days and nights, the submarine crept forward. The air grew thick. Hunger gnawed at the crew. Fear settled into their bones. After 40 grueling hours of tense navigation, U-455 finally broke into the Mediterranean. Against impossible odds, they'd survived. The crew must have celebrated that night, believing the hardest part was behind them. They'd beaten death at Gibraltar. They'd proven themselves elite submariners. But fate had other plans. Within weeks, U-455 would send its final transmission and vanish without a trace. After clearing Gibraltar in late January 1944, U-455 received new orders from German Naval Command. Patrol the Ligurian and Tyrrhenian seas, target Allied supply lines feeding into Italy. The Allies were pushing steadily northward after their landings at Salerno and Anzio, and every convoy of food, fuel, and ammunition was vital. German command hoped their submarines could slow the advance. For U-455, this meant sailing along Italy's western coast, striking when opportunity presented itself, then slipping back into the shadows. But those shadows were shrinking. By 1944, the Mediterranean was no longer a hunting ground for U-boats. It had become their graveyard. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Destroyers prowled the waters. Minefields choked off entire regions. What had once been a battlefield of opportunity had turned into a death trap. The final confirmed transmission from U-455 was routine, a simple message acknowledging their new patrol orders. Nothing in the tone suggested distress or malfunction. The submarine was operating as expected. ready to begin its mission. Then silence. No further reports, no requests for assistance, no acknowledgement of future orders. For German Naval Command, it was as if U-455 had simply dissolved into the sea. When weeks turned into months with no word, the Kriegsmarine officially listed U-455 as missing. 50 families received stiff official letters. The wording was cold, bureaucratic, carrying the devastating news that sons, brothers, husbands had disappeared. The letters arrived at homes across Germany, dropped through mail slots like bombs that destroyed lives in seconds. Mothers opened envelopes expecting routine updates and instead found confirmation that their boys were missing. Wives were left to raise children alone, explaining to toddlers that daddy wasn't coming home, but they didn't know why. Siblings lost brothers without ever getting to say goodbye. There were no bodies to bury, no wreckage to confirm their deaths, no explanation to hold on to. Just absence, stretching into decades. Some families held on to hope for years. Maybe the crew had been captured. Maybe they were prisoners of war in some Allied camp. Maybe somehow they'd survived. But as months turned into years and no word came, that hope withered into something more painful: not knowing. For the German Navy, it was another entry in a long list of submarines lost to the unforgiving Mediterranean. For the families, it was an open wound that would never fully heal. Theories started immediately. Some believed U-455 had struck a German minefield laid off the Italian coast, possibly without proper coordination or warning to submarine crews. Others argued that Allied aircraft or destroyers might have spotted the submarine and attacked. A few speculated about mechanical failure, an unexpected explosion in the engine room or torpedo bay with no time to escape. But without evidence, without wreckage, it was all just speculation. For decades, U-455's fate remained one of those maritime mysteries that haunted historians and naval veterans. The silence surrounding it wasn't just a military records issue. It was the silence that descended on entire families who never learned what happened to their loved ones. Unlike sailors lost on surface ships where debris or bodies might wash ashore, the men of U-455 simply vanished into a watery grave, sealed from the world above. This silence held for 66 years, through the end of the war, through the rebuilding of Europe, through generations of people who never knew their grandfathers. The Mediterranean kept its secret, and U-455 remained nothing more than a name on a missing list. Two men who had served on U-455, Gerhard Schwartz and Helmut Spitzer, were reassigned to training duties before the submarine's final mission. They survived the war. They knew exactly who was aboard when U-455 left port, and they lived with the knowledge that a simple twist of fate had saved their lives while condemning 50 of their comrades to death. Until 2010, when a diver's flashlight pierced the darkness 400 feet below the surface, and the silence finally broke. Roberto Raldi and his diving team were exploring the seabed off the Bay of Genoa when they found it. Rising from the silt, half buried in mud, was an unmistakable shape, a submarine. But it was the position that stopped them cold. The bow was pointing upward at a sharp angle, as if the submarine had been frozen mid-ascent. This wasn't the orderly ruin of a vessel that settled peacefully on the ocean floor. This was the twisted, violent stillness of a ship caught in its final desperate struggle. The hull was encrusted with decades of coral and sea life. No numbers were visible. No insignia survived. The ocean had erased the obvious markers. But the submarine's silhouette and construction spoke volumes. This was a German Type 6C. Then the divers noticed something that made their blood run cold. The entrance hatch wasn't just damaged, it was sealed. Twisted metal had locked it shut, as though the ocean itself had imprisoned the crew inside forever. The forward compartment showed no signs of escape attempts, no blown hatches, no emergency releases triggered. The submarine had gone down fast, and the crew had gone down with it. This wasn't just a wreck, it was a tomb. 50 men were still sealed in that steel coffin, resting in the darkness since 1944. Every shadowy compartment visible through the wreckage wasn't empty space. It was a grave chamber, frozen in time, holding the remains of men who'd been waiting 66 years to be found. Recognizing the enormity of their discovery, Raldi contacted submarine historians Mark and Luke Breyer, curators of the Atlantic Wall Museum. Together, they began the painstaking process of identification. The divers could only learn so much from the wreck itself, so the team turned to military archives. In Freiburg, Germany, they found the crucial piece of information. Records revealed that only 3 U-boats were unaccounted for in the Mediterranean. The wreck's size, location, and construction narrowed it down to one submarine, U-455. When divers explored the wreck more thoroughly, they discovered vital clues frozen in time. The periscope was still extended, locked in the up position. This meant U-455 had been navigating near the surface during its last moments, likely scanning for threats or navigational markers when disaster struck. The stern section was missing, blasted apart by what appeared to be a violent explosion. But the submarine had gone down intact, not broken apart during descent. There was no scattered debris field spreading across the seabed. This suggested the explosion happened suddenly, catastrophically, giving the crew no time to react. But here's where the investigation took its most shocking turn. During a later expedition, using the Remora submersible, researchers made a discovery that would finally solve the mystery. Not far from the wreck, divers found a German mine resting on the ocean floor. Historians cross-referenced German, Italian, and British mine maps of the area. What they discovered was devastating. U-455 had been ordered to rally at a specific point at 2200 hours, where a surface ship would escort them. To reach that rally point, the submarine's route took them directly through a German minefield. But here's the tragic part. Commander Geisler apparently never received maps showing where those mines were located. The information was top secret, and in the chaos of war, someone had forgotten to provide the submarine with the critical intelligence they needed to survive. After escaping 9 missions, after surviving Allied attacks across the Atlantic, after threading through the impossible passage of Gibraltar, U-455 was killed by its own side's weapons. 50 men died because someone forgot to send a map. Behind every name on U-455's crew roster was a young man who never came home. Most were in their late teens or early 20s, men who'd known no adult life beyond war. They lived in claustrophobic quarters, slept in bunks still warm from the previous occupant, and spent their days maintaining machinery in the endless darkness of submarine life. Commander Hans Heinrich Geisler, born in 1911, was a career officer whose reputation centered on quiet competence rather than flashy heroics. For the men aboard U-455, his steady leadership would have been a source of calm in the suffocating world beneath the waves. He guided them through 9 missions, celebrated their victories, and navigated them through Gibraltar's deadly gauntlet. He died with them in the Mediterranean, still at his post, trying to bring his crew home. But fate proved fickle for 2 men. Gerhard Schwartz and Helmut Spitzer had both served on U-455 living through the same claustrophobic patrols, the same depth charge attacks, the same desperate moments when death seemed certain. In early 1944, they were reassigned to training duties before the submarine's Mediterranean mission. At the time, they might have felt frustrated, maybe even ashamed, being pulled from a combat crew. But that reassignment saved their lives. Years later, Gerhard Schwartz traveled to Genoa. He stood at the shoreline, looking out at the waters where U-455 rested 400 feet below. For him, this wasn't a historical site or a tourist attraction. It was a grave containing 50 comrades he'd left behind. He remembered the camaraderie, the way laughter still found its place in cramped quarters, the shared meals of canned meat and stale bread, the quiet moments when someone would play a harmonica, and for a few minutes, fear gave way to reflection. These weren't monsters or propaganda symbols. They were men who formed bonds in that steel tube, a family born of claustrophobic danger and shared mortality. Helmut Spitzer recounted tales of the Atlantic patrols, the long hunts where U-455 stalked Allied convoys under cover of night. He remembered the pride that surged when they scored victories against enemy shipping. But he also remembered the other side, the crushing fatigue, the claustrophobic terror, and the growing realization by 1943 that the hunters had become the hunted. Everyone knew the tide had turned. Everyone felt the odds shifting against them. And yet they kept going, kept diving, kept hunting, because that's what warriors did. The discovery of U-455 gave families something they'd been denied for 66 years: closure. Where once there was only speculation and empty hope, now there was certainty. Their loved ones hadn't escaped. They were still there, resting together in the steel chamber that had defined their final years. But that closure came with a devastating truth. These men had survived impossible odds. They'd escaped British destroyers, American aircraft, depth charges that shook their submarine like a toy. They'd threaded through Gibraltar when 9 other U-boats had failed. They'd done everything right, and then they sailed into a minefield that their own command had laid. Without anyone warning them, it was there. Today, U-455 rests undisturbed off the coast of Italy, its bow still pointing upward as if frozen in its final desperate reach for the surface. The wreck is legally protected as a war grave. By law and by custom, the hatches remain sealed, not just because of danger, but out of respect for the 50 men who never escaped. For divers who visit, U-455 isn't treated as an artifact. It's a memorial. The rusting steel is draped in silence, and each passing decade adds weight to what it represents: sacrifice, loss, and the ocean that never forgets. The discovery changed how historians view the U-boat campaign.
A German U-boat, which sank almost a century ago, has been discovered off the southwest of Scotland.
Nazi propaganda portrayed the Grey Wolves as ruthless predators, but wrecks like U-455 reveal a different truth. These men were fragile, often young, caught in a war machine that consumed them. The submarine that once represented Hitler's naval power now serves as a sobering reminder that even the mightiest weapons can be silenced by the very forces that created them. What destroyed U-455 remains one of the story's most tragic ironies. The theories that circulated for decades, Allied attack, mechanical failure, enemy action, all missed the mark. The submarine survived everything the Allies threw at it across 9 missions. It was killed by a German mine, laid by German forces, because someone failed to provide a simple map. 50 men died in the most preventable way imaginable. For survivors, Gerhard Schwartz and Helmut Spitzer, the memory of U-455 lasted their entire lives. Their testimony serves as a bridge connecting the steel tomb underwater with the world above. When Schwartz stood at that Genoa shoreline, looking out at waters that had swallowed his comrades, he wasn't just remembering the dead. He was honoring the brotherhood, men bound in steel and silence, a family that he carried until the day he died. The wreck of U-455 tells us something important about war. It's easy to see submarines as machines, weapons, tools of destruction, but inside that twisted metal are 50 individual stories. 50 young men who laughed at shared jokes, wrote letters home, wondered if they'd survive another patrol. Men who trusted their leaders, followed their orders, and died because someone, somewhere, made a mistake. The Mediterranean doesn't forget, and now, neither should we. The story of U-455 isn't about steel and torpedoes. It's about memory, tragedy, and the price paid by men who were told they were predators, but discovered too late they were prey. Their submarine still points upward, frozen in that final moment, reaching for a surface it will never touch again. And beneath those sealed hatches, 50 men rest together, warriors who walked the deep, hunters who became the hunted, brothers who never came home.